or governments would tie foreign aid to the conditions of democratic transition. What emerges, and I don't know if it's still the case now, and this might be a great job for you, what emerges in the early 1990s is a whole cottage industry of democracy consultants. It was a big deal in Washington, D.C. Young people like yourself would go find a job in Washington, D.C. and become a democracy consultant, constitutional crafters, constitutional advisors, and so on. And we also see non-governmental organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy. We see journals like the Journal of Democracy begin to proliferate, all as a way of promoting democracy. And again, China by this time was fully integrated into the global economy and fully integrated into the global community. And so therefore it was expected that the forces of the moral imperative, that the contagious nature of democracy, that the primacy on human rights, and the power and pressures of foreign policy would create democracy in China. Yet again, no democracy. The question, therefore, that I want to spend the rest of today's time is, why is there no democracy in China? What's the problem? We've seen so far lots of moments in which China has flirted with democracy. Has flirted with the idea of democracy, and yet, for some reason, we still don't see democracy. We saw under Mao potential political economic crisis, which may have blossomed into democracy, and yet no democracy. We see economic modernization under Deng Xiaoping, and yet no democracy. We see the globalization of democracy, where the whole world is talking about democracy, and yet no democracy in China. So why not? Well, one argument is that democracy grew out of the West. That democracy is a Western construct. It's a reflection of Western liberal ideas and Western philosophy. Whereas in Asia, Asian values are such that Asian peoples therefore privilege things like collectivity. If in the West it's all about individualism and liberal individualism, in the East or in Asian values it's about collectivity. It's about deference to authority. It's about a set of cultural values that prioritize hierarchy as a way of promoting harmony. That excessive liberal individualism is the antithesis to harmony, but rather liberal individualism is the creator of chaos. In other words, China does not have this Western heritage. So therefore, why should we expect China, the adherent to Asian values, to embrace democracy? But on the other hand, there are lots of Asian democracies. Japan is in Asia, it's a democracy. India is in Asia, it's a democracy. Taiwan, South Korea are in Asia, they are democracies as well. In this respect, China is an outlier. One could also argue that all cultures are inherently authoritarian. That all cultures are inherently authoritarian, but they can evolve and change over time. And again, I want to stress, even China, the greatest trumpeter of Asian values, has long flirted with the idea of Western democracy. In 1913, just after the Republican Revolution, we see the rise of what's called the New Culture movement in China. And this New Culture movement was a time when students and intellectuals believed in a new modern China and embraced as their symbols Mr. Democracy, as they called it, and Mr. Science. In many ways, in 1913, the New Culture movement was an embracing of the West. And some of the leading thinkers of this time, some of the leading authors of this particular movement were educated in the West, most notably educated in New York. So it's not as though in Chinese history it has not flirted with not just democracy, but also democracy. In 1978, again, the Democracy Wall movement in Beijing, in which we see students mobilizing and calling for an end to the totalitarian regime in demanding more political and economic freedoms, a la the West, that used the term democracy. June 4th, Tiananmen Square of 1989. The symbol for the students in that square was the Statue of Liberty. Probably one of the most iconic symbols of Western democracy. In 2008, intellectuals in China started an internet movement called Charter 08, an online petition demanding political reform in China. The key point I want to make here is that, notwithstanding the power of Asian values, China has flirted with the idea of democracy a lot. And it's not a new relationship with democracy at all. So if Asian values, therefore, then are a less compelling argument as to why we don't see democracy, what are some of the other challenges? The first is stability and economic growth. The argument goes in China that democracy is chaotic. That democracy leads to legislative deadlock. That democracy leads to these debates that are going on right now in the United States. Leads to a president who is a Democrat and a Congress that is dominated by Republicans. In other words, democracy is chaotic, whereas authoritarianism provides order. And it's under this authoritarian regime that the Chinese Communist Party is attempting to promote a harmonious society and trying to create socioeconomic stability in the world. It's also believed that authoritarianism is frankly better at promoting development. That pluralism in democracy, in fact, is in many ways antithetical to development. The argument goes that authoritarian states can make decisions more quickly. They can make decisions and implement those decisions more effectively and more efficiently. In fact, so the Chinese leadership will say, if you look at the fastest growing economies in the post-war period, places like Taiwan, Korea, Hong Kong, they were all authoritarian. Those economies, those Asian tigers, grew most quickly, not when they were democracies in the 1990s. They grew most quickly when they were autocratic regimes in the 1960s and 1970s. Because they could make decisions more quickly. They could allocate resources more effectively. And lastly, so the argument goes, authoritarianism is better for China in economic growth because, frankly, global capital, our firms, our multinational corporations, want stability. They don't want workers in the streets mobilizing. They don't want instability or political instability. They don't want one government in power in China one day and 4 years later dealing with a completely different beast. Global capital wants predictability, stability, and order. And so the argument goes in China, democratic processes are too slow, and therefore, if we want to attract global capital, we need to have stability. And to have stability, you need authoritarianism. So, quick question to all of you ideological Democrats. What scenario would you prefer? A, 10% economic growth per year. Fantastic, that means jobs for you. But no elections, no freedom of press and speech, and human rights abuses. Or 3% economic growth per year, which likely means no jobs for you, but with free and fair elections, freedoms, and human rights.
Oh no, I turned it on.
20% of you would be willing to trade off your democracy for economic growth. 4/5 of you would prefer democracy even if it meant slower growth. So you're different from the Chinese, or at least according to the Chinese. What's the second challenge? So the first challenge to democracy, or why we don't see democracy, is because of the imperatives of economic growth. The second challenge is this notion of the benevolent dictator. We know that benevolent dictators are very hard to depose. So during the Sichuan earthquake of 2008, when 70,000 people died and 400,000 people were injured in China, Premier Wu Jiabao was out there on the scene on that day. Right? In a helicopter, all the news media there, the Prime Minister of the country. After this massive earthquake, when there were aftershocks, when there obviously is just the pure horror that would be seeing 70,000 people dead and 400,000 injured. And you see the Premier, Wu Jiabao, out on the side. Indeed, Wu Jiabao and the current president of China are very much beloved. Right? I mean, Wu Jiabao is considered, I mean, this is not my term, I mean, people call him Grandpa Wu. You know, he's caring. And so when they say things like, we really want to create a harmonious society, we really do believe that levels of inequality in China are too high. That while it is true that Deng Xiaoping said some will get rich quicker and some will have to stay poor for a while, we now believe it's time to change that. We really care. We really do believe in being compassionate. And therefore, one of the challenges to democracy then is that you have dictators who are viewed as benevolent. And who, as by all accounts, as individuals, are really nice people. And are not at all crazy like him. So we have bad dictator, North Korea, that is starving, and we have nice dictator, much more difficult to depose. Third challenge is nationalism. China has a lot to be proud of. You go back and you look at that data from 1960 to 1978, you look at how poor China was. I mean, you saw what economic growth rates were like, or level of GDP. You saw it was flatlined for almost 2 decades. Since that time, China has lots to be impressed by and lots to be proud of. It was truly an economic basket case in 1978. Indeed, even in the 20 years in which I've been going to China, my impressions of China have changed enormously. I remember the time where I would take a train from Shanghai to Beijing, and I'd be standing on this train for 18 hours. This was, that sort of life was very normal in China at the time. And now, of course, you can take the bullet train from those two cities and be there in a matter of hours. As you saw in that economic data, the GDP was so low between 1960 and 1978, and China is now the second largest economy in the world. It's not a question of when it will be the largest country. It's not a question of if it will be the largest economy. It's now just a matter of when China will be the largest economy in the world. So you can imagine there's a tremendous sense of pride in China. Right? I mean, now it's interesting when you talk about the rise of China, when you talk to colleagues in China, they don't say it's the rise of China, it's the re-rise of China. They are brimming with such confidence to say, no, it's not just this one-time only rise. China was a great civilization while the rest of you were still living in crap. This is just the re-rise. We are just retaking our place in the global sun. So as you can imagine that, in many ways, this legitimates the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party, notwithstanding the disaster that was Mao, has done a pretty good job. So much so that the Washington consensus is now rivaled by the Beijing consensus. That there are now economists, serious economists around the world, looking at the Chinese model of economic development as a rival to the Washington consensus. That very consensus that we have propagated here in the West and it's used in all of the international organizations. This, of course, legitimates the Chinese Communist Party. Why would we want an alternative, we are asked all the time, when it comes to asking about democracy in China? This nationalism feeds into this resistance to foreign interference. Look, anytime you have a nationalist society, and a nationalist society that was founded upon the aggressions of foreign countries over its own near history, it's no wonder that what we're going to see is a kind of nationalism that resists foreign interference. The foreigner has done nothing but wreak havoc on Chinese society, and to the extent that foreign capital has done any good for Chinese society is due to the masterful manipulation of the Chinese Communist Party. Another manifestation of nationalism is the imperative to guard China's sovereignty. No country has the right to tell China how it should deal with Tibet, or the Uyghur population in Western China and Xinjiang, or even Taiwan. I recall one time being in Shanghai giving a lecture, and one of the students in the class, who was from Canada, said, on the matter of foreign policy with respect to Taiwan, and this young Chinese student just immediately stood up, straight back, and said, Taiwan is not a foreign policy issue. It's a domestic policy issue. And unless you get that straight, we can't have a conversation. That was seen as an infringement on Chinese sovereignty. This is a nationalism that guards Chinese sovereignty. As a result, should it come as any surprise that democracy is simply seen as a form of Western imperialism. It's seen as an imposition. Maybe not by war, as we see in Afghanistan or Japan, not through colonialism, as many argue would be the case in India, but through international pressure, through the actions of American presidents and American secretaries of state, through the actions of the British Prime Minister, through the actions and the words of our own Canadian Prime Minister. In other words, then democracy, in this nationalist discourse in China, is seen as a form of Western imperialism. People's Daily, shortly after when Jiabao makes his statements about democracy being irresistible in China, the People's Daily, which is essentially the mouthpiece for the Chinese Communist Party, writes in an editorial, the idea that China's political reform is seriously lagging behind its remarkable economic development, which is what we say, right? Modernization theory says that, boy, you've got tremendous economic development, why is your political development so far behind? It says it's not only contrary to the law of objectivity, basically meaning we're all stupid for thinking that, but also to the objective facts. In promoting political reform, we shouldn't copy the Western political system model. We shouldn't engage in something like multi-party coalition government or separation of powers among the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. We should stick to our own way. So as you can see here, this is a clear indication of how at least this, the mouthpiece of the Chinese Communist Party, understands democracy as a Western imposition. And not only understands it as a Western imposition, but that as a model, it's inappropriate for China. The West continues to meddle in China. And for the Chinese and for the Chinese nationalism, it's about sticking to their own way. So I've talked about three challenges so far. The imperative is economic growth, benevolent dictators as opposed to crazy dictators, and nationalism. How about adaptive authoritarianism? As Andy Nathan points out in your readings this week, China's is a dynamic authoritarianism. Today's Chinese Communist Party, today's CCP is not the same as the Chinese Communist Party under Mao. It is an authoritarianism that is intent on economic reform. And it has done a lot of economic reform. It has opened up its economy to international trade and foreign capital. It has liberalized its economy. It has really staked its future on material wealth. It's no longer about let's all suffer and toil together in the communes. Now it's about get yourself that car. Right? We know that the luxury goods market is now the highest in China. We know that, for instance, all of the flagship stores for luxury brands are in China. It's really interesting, actually. I had a conversation with a colleague of mine who's in marketing. When the rest of the world economy is tanking, and you began to see stores like Louis Vuitton, Maserati, Bentley, all these very high-end brands beginning to discount their prices in places like Toronto, New York, LA, and so on, prices didn't change in Shanghai. And the reason was twofold. One, people in China could still afford it. And two, the future of material wealth was China. So as a branding strategy, you don't discount prices in Shanghai. Right? If you're the super rich who shop in Shanghai, no longer in LA or New York. We see a Chinese Communist Party that now is intent on middle-class prosperity and social mobility. No one wants you to be poor in China. Everybody wants you to get rich. It's not as though the Chinese Communist Party is not sympathetic to political opening. We know that more dissent is tolerated now. For those of you who are able to read the microblogs, for instance, the equivalents of things like Twitter and whatnot, in China will know that there is a whole layer of dissent in the cyber world that is harshly critical of the Chinese government. And the Chinese government, partly because it can't do anything about it, has come to accept this. That there is now more political space than ever before. The Chinese Communist Party today welcomes deliberation. Not deliberation in the sense that you and I think about it here, where we can argue and whatnot, but it now seeks consultation. It will consult with different members of society in deliberating its own policies. And increasingly, many people are saying that the Chinese Communist Party is not a monolithic autocracy, but rather it's a hybrid regime. That yes, fundamentally it is non-democratic, but no, it is not the autocracy of the 1950s and 1960s. That there is some political openness, there is some freedom of the press, there are some elections, particularly local elections, even if they're not really contested. There are some freedoms and so on, but still short of what we might see as being a democracy, partly because of the absence of any alternative. The key point I want to make here is one of the challenges, therefore, to democracy in China is the adaptability of the Chinese Communist Party. Just as I try to argue that a benevolent dictator is hard to depose, it's hard to oppose a regime that has created extraordinary economic growth, a regime that is increasingly accepting of political dissent, one that carries with it a much gentler face, and one that is increasingly able and willing to accommodate conflict and dissent. China's Chinese Communist Party is not democratic in the sense of oligarchy and institutionalized uncertainty and alternatives, but it's flexible. It's flexible in many ways like democracy is, so long as it continues to foster economic growth. The very last challenge, then we'll finish there. The very last challenge to democracy in China is that in the end, no matter what modernization theory says, you have to choose democracy. As Andy and Nathan say, authoritarian regimes in this sense are not forever. For all their diversity and longevity, as I've just explained, they live under the shadow of the future, vulnerable to existential challenges that mature democracies do not face. I'm not so sure that I agree with Andy. He's basically arguing, as modernization theory would argue, that as societies modernize, economically and socially, that it's inevitable that democracy will arrive. The problem with modernization theory, however, is that there is no what we call in political science agency. It's a structural theory. As long as you meet these prerequisites, democracy should magically appear. And as I stressed to you weeks ago, democracies don't suddenly appear. As I stressed weeks ago, you don't go to bed one night without a democracy and the next morning there is one there. That just magically appears. Rather, democracy can only arrive when it's chosen. You have to choose democracy. And that choice tends to have to be made by the authoritarian regime. The authoritarian regime, unless it is physically deposed. The authoritarian regime, in other words, the Chinese Communist Party, has to decide itself that it wants democracy. And I suggest to you that this is a very hard decision to make. Because if you think about it, to choose democracy, for the Chinese Communist Party to choose democracy, is a decision that will allow for the possibility of its own demise. It has to choose the possibility that it may itself be deposed, that it may itself lose. And history has shown us that this is highly unlikely. Usually democracy or autocracies hang on for as long as possible. They tend not to choose democracy because choosing democracy is tantamount to the possibility of your own defeat. Let's revisit again, and then we'll be done. Will China become a democracy in the next 20 years? Just so you know, the first time I asked you, will China be a democracy in 20 years, 32% of you said yes. And this time, 20% of you said yes. Have a good week. We'll see you soon.